The wind moved like memory across the plains that morning, slow, dry, and quiet as breath drawn in sorrow. Dust clung to the hem of dawn, curling beneath wagon wheels that creaked beneath their burden. The trail wound down from the hills into a town that looked half-dreamed, half-abandoned, where paint flaked from shuttered windows and church bells hadn't rung in seasons. At the back of the wagon, a woman sat with her hands bound and a coarse sack drawn over her head. She could hear the horses snorting, the reins slack in someone's grip. She did not speak. She hadn't spoken in hours, maybe days. There was no use in talking when no one asked questions worth answering. They had taken her from the edge of the territory, dragged her from the station where she had waited too long with a crumpled letter in her fist. The man who wrote it never came. She had memorized the words anyway, promises pressed between neat lines. A home. A hearth. Her name scrawled like it meant something. Now her name was not even called. The man who claimed her heart had not come to claim her body. And so the others did. The wagon jostled to a halt. She heard men's boots scuffing dirt, the lazy chatter of a crowd forming. The sack itched. Her throat burned. She listened. A bell rang once, flat and hollow. The auction was beginning. She had heard tales of these places. Corners of the West where laws bent like reeds in the wind and a woman left unclaimed was a woman for sale. They didn't ask what dreams she carried. They didn't care about blue ribbons or garden songs or the ache behind her eyes. She was currency now. Bone and breath, eyes and hip. There were others, too, silent shapes pulled from wagons and holding pens. Some younger. Some with children clinging to their skirt. No one spoke of names. Just weight. Just value. She was last in the line. One by one they were sold, not with gavel cracks but with nods and spitting laughter. One woman wept. Another stared like her soul had slipped sideways. The crowd shifted with appetite, eyes full of measurement, of hunger that had nothing to do with food. When her turn came, someone grabbed her arm. She stumbled forward, boots catching on a stone. Her knees struck dirt. The sack was still on. A voice from the platform barked her description. No kin. No dowry. No escort. Abandoned at station, passed through 2 towns, quiet as a mule. The words fell like nails into a box meant to hold her. She held herself still, trembling only on the inside. The man next to the auctioneer said they ought to skip her. Said she wasn't worth the trouble. No man wanted what another had thrown away. No name. No papers. A shadow, not a woman. Laughter followed, soft and mean. And then, a voice broke through the dust. Not loud. Not urgent. But certain. That one's mine. Silence followed. Even the flies seemed to pause mid-flight. The auctioneer squinted toward the back of the crowd. Some heads turned. Others stared, waiting for the joke to land. No one stepped forward right away. I said, the voice repeated, just slightly louder this time, she's mine. Boots sounded across packed earth. Slow, deliberate steps cutting a path through the cluster of watchers. She couldn't see him, but she could hear the hush ripple out from where he walked, like a ripple in calm water. The sack was pulled from her head. Sunlight struck her eyes like a slap. She blinked against it, her vision filling with shapes, blurry faces, some cruel, some curious, some merely there to see something happen. And then she saw him. A man not young, not old. His face worn like river stone, not sharp, but strong in a quiet way. Dust clung to his shoulders, and a brimmed hat shaded his eyes. He looked at her like he already knew the shape of her silence. Like it didn't scare him. He didn't touch her. Didn't reach. He only looked up at the man on the platform and said, "She's my wife." The auctioneer scoffed. "Got papers to prove that?" The man said nothing at first. Just slid a folded paper from his coat and handed it over. The crowd leaned in, hungry for drama. After a pause, the auctioneer handed it back, grumbling. "Guess that settles it." Someone spat into the dirt. "Ain't right. She's half broke already." The man turned his eyes toward the voice, and though he said nothing, the heckler stepped back. She stood there, unsure what to do with her hands. With her body. with the sudden shift in fate that wasn't hers to steer. He looked at her then, fully. No shame, no rush. Just steady seeing. Like she was a map and he meant to read her slowly. "You coming?" he asked. The question wasn't harsh. Wasn't sweet. It just was. She hesitated. Then stepped forward. The crowd parted. He helped her into the saddle, though he never touched her skin, only offered his coat to cover her shoulders. She realized then she was shaking. Not from fear. Not entirely. The wind picked up behind them as they rode from town. No one called out. No one tried to stop them. Some things end not with noise, but with the closing of a door, the turning of a back. As the town shrank behind them, she looked down at her hands. Still trembling. Still bound. But this time, she felt something strange begin to rise beneath her ribs. Not hope, not yet. But maybe the ghost of it. She glanced sideways at the man beside her. He didn't look back. Just kept the reins steady, eyes forward, like he knew where they were going and why it mattered. She didn't know his name. He hadn't asked for hers. But when the wind passed through them again, she thought she heard it whisper something that felt like a promise. Not loud. Just enough to keep riding. The road stretched wide and empty, stitched by the hooves of his horse and the creak of leather. She sat behind him, the man's coat pulled tight across her shoulders, dust in her throat and silence in her bones. He hadn't spoken since they left the town behind. She didn't know if that meant safety or something quieter, more dangerous. The prairie yawned beneath a sky too large for comfort. Everything out here moved slow, measured, like the land itself was watching. He didn't ride fast. That was the first thing she noticed. Most men in the West galloped through life like it was a race to the grave. But this one, he rode like the world would wait for him. And maybe it would. By the time the sun folded itself behind the hills, they'd reached the edge of a pinewood hollow. There, tucked into a slope as if trying not to be noticed, stood a cabin. Weather-worn but not weary. The porch was swept. The hinges didn't creak. A chair leaned against the railing like someone meant to come back and sit in it. He dismounted without a word, tied the reins, then reached up to help her down. He offered his hand. She stared at it a moment, then took it. His grip was warm but not possessive. It wasn't the hand of a man claiming. It was the hand of someone guiding. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and old pine. The hearth was swept clean, kindling stacked like soldiers in a line. A pot hung over cold coals. On the table, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, still soft. She stood there, unsure what to do, waiting for the turn. There was always a turn, when the kindness dropped like a curtain and the man beneath it showed his true face. Instead, he pointed toward a small cot near the back wall. Clean blanket. Extra pillow. He set his bedroll by the fire. He said, "You'll be safe here." Then nothing more. That night she couldn't sleep. The blanket smelled of cedar. A breeze came in through the window cracks. The man didn't snore. He just lay quiet, arms folded, facing the fire, as if sleep was something he could take or leave. She watched the glow of embers for hours. In the morning, he was gone. She woke with a start, half ready to flee, half afraid she already missed him. Then she saw him through the window, splitting wood. Shirt sleeves rolled, movements steady. He looked like someone who made peace with solitude a long time ago. Not because he wanted it, but because he learned how to live without needing noise. She stepped outside. He looked up, nodded. Wordless, he handed her a tin cup of coffee. Not strong, not bitter, just hot. He didn't tell her where to sit, but there was a crate nearby and she took it. They drank in silence, morning birds calling from the trees. It went like that for days. He worked the land with quiet hands, fixing a loose fence post, brushing the mare, turning soil by the garden bed. She watched at first. Then, slowly, she offered her hands too. Not out of gratitude, not out of debt, just needing to move, to do. He didn't praise her, didn't correct her either. Just let her work beside him like she belonged. When she brought in kindling, He cleared a space for it near the hearth. When she made bread, he left her be, only paused long enough to set fresh butter beside her at the table. At night, she caught him looking at the stars. Not longing, just remembering. He spoke little. But when he did, it was with care. Like every word had weight, and he didn't want to spend them poorly. Once, she asked about the hills to the west. He said, "Good land there, but it don't listen to you easy." Another time, when she dropped a pail and muttered under her breath, he said, "Doesn't make you weak. Just makes you human." It was strange, how that sentence felt like something she'd been waiting years to hear. Then came the letter. She found it by accident. A drawer half open in the small writing desk by the window. She hadn't meant to pry. Her hands were dusting, not digging. But paper catches the eye, and this one was half folded, words smudged in the corners. A man's handwriting, neat but slanted with urgency. "If you find this, it means I couldn't wait anymore." I looked. God knows I tried. "I hope you found peace somewhere." No name. No address. She placed it back where she found it, heart thudding. Was it about a woman? A sister? A lover? She didn't ask. And he never mentioned it. But she watched him closer after that, the way his shoulders settled when he was near the fire, or how he sometimes sat with a book he never turned the pages of. A man with stories written in silence. One morning, she was kneading dough when he stepped inside, wiping his hands on a cloth. He said, "I'm going to the creek. You want to come?" She hesitated, then nodded. They walked side by side through a trail that carved between tall grass and cottonwood. The sky above them was wide and forgiving. When they reached the water, he rolled up his sleeves and stepped in. She sat on the bank, watching. He didn't ask her anything, didn't prod. Just stood in the current like it might wash something off him. After a while, she spoke. "Why did you say I was your wife?" He didn't look at her right away. "Because no one else did. And I figured someone should." She blinked, waited for more. But that was all he offered. He splashed his face, then added, "You looked like someone who deserved better than being discarded." She felt the words settle in her, not like flattery, but like truth. Heavy, warm. Back at the cabin, she lit the fire for supper. He brought in fish from the creek. They ate quietly, but the silence had changed. It wasn't the silence of strangers anymore. It was the silence of people who had stopped pretending. Before sleep, she stood by the door, looking out at the dark. He passed by with his bedroll, paused beside her. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Not your thanks, not your trust, not even your name." She didn't answer. But something in her began to breathe again. That night, the wind curled against the cabin like a cat against a leg, soft and alive. And when she lay down, her hands didn't shake quite as much. She didn't dream of running. She dreamed of water, and soil, and something fragile pressing up through the dirt, unsure, but reaching anyway. Spring did not arrive all at once. It crept in slow, like an apology. The frost clung to the mornings longer than it should have, and the creek still hissed cold when the wind caught it just right. But there were signs, soft green shoots unfurling beside stones, bird calls before dawn, and the scent of damp soil rising up like a memory. She found herself waking before him now, slipping outside to watch the sun yawn over the hills. The man still slept light. One shift from her and he stirred, though he never opened his eyes. Never asked where she went or why. She had started a garden by the east fence, kneeling in the dirt with sleeves rolled and heart steady. Not because she loved the work, not yet, but because something in her needed to make things grow. The land didn't ask questions. It didn't care about the sack pulled off her head or the silence that had grown heavy in her chest. It just offered itself, waiting to see what she'd plant. He brought her seeds in a little cloth pouch. Didn't say where he got them. Just set them down beside her with a nod. Carrots, beans, a few herbs she didn't recognize. She opened the pouch slowly, as if touching something sacred. He didn't linger. Just went back to fixing the gate. They work side by side most days now, sometimes in step, sometimes apart. There was still little talk between them, not because they had nothing to say, but because they had stopped needing to fill the air with noise. He taught her things without speaking. How to spot a weak branch before it split, how to stack wood so it didn't fall, how to mend leather without losing its shape. She picked up his quiet rhythms, began to move through the world with the same patient strength. One morning, she noticed the little tin box near the hearth had been opened. Inside were photographs, yellowed at the corners, faces stiff with old expressions. A man and a woman seated on a porch. A child between them. The woman held a book. The man a rifle. She didn't ask. But that night, when the fire burned low and the sky outside turned the color of coal dust, he said, almost absently, they died in a flood. Years ago. Before I came here. She looked up from her sewing. He wasn't facing her. I stayed in the house a while after, he added. Long enough for it to stop feeling like it belonged to them. She waited. Then I came here. Built this with my own hands. Didn't want it to carry their shadows. Just mine. He didn't cry. Didn't tighten his jaw or look away. He just spoke like he was letting the air carry the weight of it. She said nothing. But she listened, and in that listening something passed between them. Not pity. Not rescue. Recognition. She told him a piece of her own story a week later. Kneeling beside him at the creek as she scrubbed a shirt against the stones, she said softly, "He left me waiting 3 days at that station. I never knew why. I never asked. He didn't look up. Didn't say she was better off. Just nodded like he understood something deep and wordless. I think I started dying right there on the bench," she continued. "The part that believed I was ever wanted. Ever chosen." A long pause. "Then, you're not dead." And somehow that was enough. Summer warmed the wood, softened the hills, coaxed green from every corner. Her hands grew strong. Her arms darkened in the sun. She had a laugh now, quiet, rare, but real. The man didn't try to claim it. Just glanced at her when it came out, like hearing a melody he didn't expect but was glad for. She found herself humming again, sometimes when she cooked, sometimes when she swept the porch. Little tunes with no name. Just sound. One evening, thunder rolled in from the west. Low, distant at first, then curling into the valley like a threat. He moved quickly, securing shutters, bringing the horses into the stable. She helped without needing instruction. They worked in rhythm, a practiced pair. She didn't feel fear. Not this time. Not with him there. When the rain came, it came hard, slamming the roof, flooding the yard, tearing through the trees with a fury that felt almost holy. They sat by the fire as it passed, their shadows long against the wall. She looked at him then, truly looked, saw the lines etched deep from sun and solitude, the scar on his wrist, the way his eyes never shied away. "Why didn't you flinch that day?" she asked, voice low. He met her gaze. "At the auction?" She nodded. "Because I'd seen too many people look away from things that needed saving. I didn't want to be another one." Her throat tightened. "But you didn't know me. Didn't need to." She swallowed. "What if I'd said no? Then I'd have ridden off. No shame in that. And if I had run?" He held her eyes. "Then I'd have hoped you ran toward something better." She let the silence settle between them like a blanket. Warm. Protective. He added, almost as an afterthought, "You weren't just a girl in a sack. You were someone no one saw." And that felt too familiar. She didn't reply. But she reached out, slowly, and took his hand. Not to claim. Just to hold. He didn't pull away. The rain softened. Turned to a patter, then to mist. The storm moved on, and the cabin sighed with it. Outside, the garden waited. And something inside her, the part that had gone cold and still, began to bloom in the quiet. The summer ended with a crack of hooves on dry dirt and a name shouted across the hills. Not hers, not his, but one that made the blood drain from her face and her hands drop the basket of apples she'd just gathered. The man who had once left her at the station, the one who never came, never explained, now rode into the valley like someone returning home. He wasn't alone. 2 others rode with him, eyes sharp, mouths curled in the way of men who never had to ask for anything twice. And behind their saddles hung rifles, lazy and low, like afterthoughts. She was kneeling in the garden when she heard them. And when she stood, she didn't run. She didn't call for help. She simply walked inside, closed the door behind her, and waited. The quiet man was already reaching for his coat, his eyes unreadable but calm, like the creek after floodwater. He glanced at her just once, as if to say, "You knew this would come." She nodded. "It's him." He didn't ask how she knew. He just stepped onto the porch and met the approaching riders in the yard, where the grass had been flattened by their arrival. Dust curled around their boot. The man from her past dismounted with the ease of someone used to being obeyed. He was dressed finer than she remembered, silver buttons, polished boots, but the same empty pride sat behind his eyes. He looked past the quiet man, straight at the door she stood behind. "She's mine," he said. The quiet man didn't move. No. The stranger's laugh cracked like old wood. "She was promised to me. I paid for her passage. She left with nothing. She still owes me that." The quiet man stepped off the porch, slow and steady. "She owes no one. Least of all you." One of the others behind the stranger shifted in his saddle. The kind of man who didn't speak until he had a reason to. A shadow, not a name. "You gonna tell me you married her?" The stranger spat. "That's what they said in town. That you called her wife in front of the crowd." The quiet man nodded. "I did." The stranger's mouth twisted. "So you lied?" "No," said the quiet man, eyes level. "I chose her." That sentence landed like thunder. No flourish. No claim. Just a truth planted so deep it shook the ground beneath it. Inside, her hand found the back of a chair, gripping tight. The stranger stepped forward. "She's not yours to keep." And then the quiet man did something she had never seen him do. He raised his voice. "She's not a thing." The others stilled. Even the wind quieted. "You threw her away," he said. "Tied a sack over her head like cattle. Sold her future for a name you never meant to keep. And now you think you can ride back and drag her behind you like a prize." The stranger drew closer. "What makes you think you deserve her?" The quiet man answered without flinching. "I don't." He paused. "But I never asked her to be less than she is. And I never will." That silence that followed felt like the pause before lightning, brittle, bright, electric. Then the stranger reached for his belt. The quiet man didn't move. But the sound of the cabin door opening cracked through the moment like fire through frost. She stepped outside. Head high. Heart steady. The wind caught the hem of her dress. The stranger's eyes flicked to her. "You belong to me." Her voice was even. "I don't." "You were bought." "I was abandoned." He stepped toward her. "You don't get to choose." And this time she stepped between him and the quiet man. "I already did." The stranger stopped, something shifting behind his expression. Rage maybe. Or disbelief. Or the slow, creeping truth that she would never kneel again. She looked at the man beside her. The one who didn't claim her, didn't need to. The one who saw her in silence, and stayed. Then she looked back at the man who once left her in a station with nothing but a name. "You lost the right to call me yours the day you made me a burden." Her voice was not loud, but it rang true. "He never asked me to owe him. He just gave me room to become someone I could trust again." The stranger opened his mouth. Closed it. There was no saving face. No deal to strike. He looked at the quiet man, eyes full of venom. "You'll regret this." The quiet man held his gaze. "Then I'll live with it." The stranger turned. Spat in the dirt. Mounted his horse without another word. The 2 shadows followed. Dust swallowed them as they rode off into the distance, smaller and smaller, until the hills took them for good. She stood there, breathing, as if for the first time. The air felt different now. Like it belonged to her, too. When she turned to the man beside her, he said nothing. Just looked at her like he always had, like she wasn't a story of sorrow, but one of survival. She stepped closer. "I don't have a last name anymore," she said softly. He took that with him. He looked at her, the sun catching the lines at the corners of his eyes. "You can have mine," he said. She smiled. It wasn't giddy. It wasn't bright. It was steady. Rooted. "Not yet," she replied. And he nodded, not wounded, not impatient. "Whenever you're ready." That night they sat by the fire. No storm. No threats. Just the smell of apples baking in the hearth and the whisper of wind through the pines. She took his hand again. This time, he held it back. Outside, the stars lit the sky like scattered embers. Inside, something soft and unbreakable had finally taken shape. Because love, the kind that matters, doesn't arrive like thunder or flame. It grows like moss between stones. Quiet. Sure. Refusing to be uprooted. And as the night settled deep around them, the old ache of being unwanted melted from her bones. She had not been saved. She had simply been seen. And chosen. And that made all the difference. The wind carried dust like old secrets, whispering through the dry bones of the plains. At the edge of a railway stop too small to wear a name, a girl stood alone, her feet bare and blistered from walking, her eyes older than 12 years should allow. She had no satchel, no bonnet to shade her from the sun. Only a scrap of ribbon tied round her wrist, a fraying thing the color of dried blood. She'd arrived in silence, cradled in the back of a wagon beside sacks of flour and tin pans, traded like cargo. Her keeper was a trader, not a father. The kind of man who counted people like beans and never learned to say please. When he sold her, he didn't say her name, only her age and how she was strong for her size. The man who bought her didn't haggle. He stood tall and broad as a barn beam, boots caked in iron dust. The collar of his shirt was open, the sleeves rolled, thick arms smudged in soot like he'd been arguing with fire. He listened to the trader speak, handed over the silver, then turned to the girl like he'd expected someone smaller. She looked up, expecting cruelty. Or worse, interest. But the man simply said, "Come on, then." His voice had a tired weight, like he didn't have time for cruelty. She followed. The town was less than a mile from the tracks, a cluster of buildings leaning on each other like old friends losing strength. A general store, a saloon with only half its letters left on the sign, a whitewashed church, and behind it all, the blacksmith's shop, where heat shimmered from the forge like a living thing. He didn't tell her what her chores were. Not the first day. He showed her the small room behind the shop. A cot, a basin, a window that let in sun until the afternoon gave up. "This is yours," he said. Then he left her to wash and sleep. She did not sleep. Not really. Her bones lay still, but her breath was shallow with caution. She waited for a door to creak open in the night. Waited for the weight of regret or ownership. But nothing came. In the morning, she rose before the rooster crowed. A habit learned long ago in places that smelled of mildew and men who didn't knock. She found a broom leaning against the shop wall and swept the dust from the forge floor. She was midway through the stalls, brushing hay and keeping her head down, when he passed her a tin plate with bread and eggs, warm and buttered. "You eat," he said, and went back to the anvil. She sat on the ground to eat it, unsure if she was allowed a chair. Every bite felt like betrayal. Food should not be gentle. A week passed. The blacksmith worked from dawn to dusk, sleeves soaked in sweat and sparks. He didn't ask where she came from, didn't press her for stories. He told her which horses were skittish, showed her how to clean their hooves. When her hands blistered, he handed her salve, wordlessly. The girl didn't speak, not yet. Her words had dried up somewhere between her last place and here, wherever here was. But she watched him carefully. He had a way of hammering iron like he was trying to make it better than before. Not just shape it, redeem it. The townsfolk noticed her, of course. Some nodded politely, unsure if she was kin or kept. Others kept their distance. In towns like this, strangers stayed strange. Miss Eloise, the seamstress, was the first to break through. She visited the forge one afternoon with a torn apron and a basket of spools. She spoke with that polite twang women used when unsure where pity ended and kindness began. "Well, aren't you a little hummingbird?" she said. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The girl only blinked. "She don't talk much," the blacksmith said from his corner. "Not apologetic. Just stating fact." Miss Eloise tilted her head, studying the girl's ribboned wrist. "You keep that clean, now. Dirt gets in ribbon stitches quicker than most." She reached into her basket and pulled out a pale blue scrap, folding it into the girl's palm. "For Sunday best, when you're ready." The girl nodded barely, but something in her hand curled tight around the ribbon, holding it like a promise. Tommy was the stable boy, a year or two older than her, with ears too big for his head and a heart that showed in his grin. He tried to impress her by hopping fences and falling off more often than not. "Don't mind him," the blacksmith muttered one evening as Tommy limped past, red-cheeked and proud. "That boy's got more legs than sense." She almost smiled. The blacksmith kept to himself. Nights were quiet. Sometimes the wind played through the trees behind the forge, and she imagined voices in it, stories it had gathered on its long journey across the land. She wondered if it carried pieces of her mother's voice, or her own, lost and waiting to be returned. One evening, just as the sky tipped from gold into bruise-colored dusk, Sheriff Hell leaned on the fence post outside the shop. His badge was tarnished, his mouth always working a piece of tobacco like it might teach him patience. "You sure you know what you're doin', keepin' her?" he asked the blacksmith. The girl, stacking kindling nearby, froze. "She ain't livestock, Hal," the blacksmith said. "I ain't keeping her. She works some, eats some. That's all. You paid for her." "I paid to stop someone worse from owning her." The sheriff spat. "Just watch your step. This town doesn't like confusion." That night, the girl left a small horseshoe she'd polished beside the blacksmith's hammer. Her way of saying something without words. He didn't speak of it the next day, but he didn't move it, either. It stayed right where she left it. She began to learn the language of sparks, the sound of hot iron meeting water, the music of reshaping. She began to trust the silence between words. And slowly, something fragile started to grow. Not happiness, not yet, but safety. Like the first green shoot through winter ground, thin, trembling, alive. The trader never returned, or if he did, he didn't dare come near the forge. Weeks turned to months. The girl learned to whistle with 2 fingers. She started stitching rips in her apron. Once, she laughed at one of Tommy's jokes and startled herself with the sound. But even in this sliver of peace, she slept with one ear open. Because kindness, in her experience, was a thing men wore like coats. They could take it off. Still, the blacksmith never touched her. Never raised a hand or voice. He only said what needed saying, and sometimes not even that. But when her hand slipped while scrubbing a bridle, and she cut her palm, he bound it in a strip of his shirt and muttered, "Careful now." No anger. No lecture. Just that. On the first frost of the season, she found a book on her cot. A primer, old and cracked. Inside the cover, a note written in tight, plain letters. "Figured you might like stories better when they're yours." No signature. None needed. That night, for the first time in longer than she could remember, the girl slept deeply. Not because she trusted the world, but because, for now, she trusted one corner of it. And though the fire in the forge had died hours before, something warm glowed steady inside her, low and quiet and unquenchable. She did not know what the coming years would bring. But she began to believe, just barely, that she would still be standing to meet them. By the time the girl turned 15, the forge had become a rhythm inside her. She moved through it as if born from smoke and coal, her hands grown calloused in places that once blistered, her arms stronger than they looked. She knew the names of every horse that passed through, knew when a hoof needed trimming by the way the animal shifted its weight. In the mornings, she split kindling with precise swings. In the evenings, she poured water over the coals and listened to them hiss like tired serpents. The man she once feared had become a constant, less like a master, more like a mountain, wordless, unmoving, but present in all things. He taught her what needed teaching. How to measure iron before bending it. How to oil a saddle so it wouldn't crack with the sun. But beyond that, he offered no praise, no comfort, no unnecessary words. It was not cruelty. It was his way. Stillness wrapped in skin. She never called him father. He never asked her to. But the townspeople began to look at them differently, unsure what thread connected them. Some guessed she was a foundling, some a niece, others something stranger. Most didn't ask. They saw the blacksmith's quiet discipline, the girl's increasing confidence, and assumed she was protected. By what title, they didn't care. When she walked into town now, people nodded. Miss Eloise sometimes called her over to help fold fabrics or fetch a spool too high to reach. Old Gus, who ran the feed store, once gave her a peppermint stick and muttered, "You've got grit. Don't lose it." Even Sheriff Hal, who used to watch her like she was a match near hay, now merely tipped his hat when they passed. And Tommy, sweet, awkward Tommy, grew into his limbs like a colt finding balance. He still tried too hard to impress her. He once brought her a wounded bird wrapped in a handkerchief, eyes full of hope. She took the bird gently, nursed it back to flight. Tommy beamed. She smiled, but only with her mouth. Her heart remained locked. Trust came slow, like thaw after a long winter. It was a muscle she had to stretch carefully, 1 inch at a time. Then one day the stranger came. He rode into town on a chestnut mare, dressed finer than the land required. His boots were polished, his hat clean. He had teeth too white for the dust, and a voice that curled around words like he enjoyed the sound of himself. His name was Lyle. He asked questions. Too many. Spoke to the saloon girls like they were old friends, though none had met him before. When he stopped at the forge, the girl felt the change in the air. Not heat from fire, something colder. She was sweeping when he arrived, hair tied back, sleeves rolled. He watched her in a way that made her skin crawl, though his smile never slipped. "Well now," he said, "they didn't tell me the blacksmith kept such fine company." She didn't respond. The blacksmith stepped between them, wiping soot from his hands onto a rag. "She's not company," he said. "She works." Lyle chuckled. "That so? Looks like she's all grown now. Must be bringing in business just by standing there." The girl's jaw clenched. Her hands kept sweeping, slower now, the bristles scraping too hard across the floor. "What do you want?" the blacksmith asked. "A set of shoes for my mare, and maybe a conversation after." "About the girl." The blacksmith's eyes narrowed. "There's no conversation to have." But Lyle lingered. He watched the girl like she was a thing half-remembered, a coin he thought he'd lost but found shining in the dirt. The next morning, he returned with a bag of coin and an offer. "She's grown into something valuable," he said. "Don't tell me you haven't noticed. Whatever you paid for her, I'll double it." The blacksmith said nothing at first. Then he took the coin, slow and deliberate, and scattered it into the forge. It hissed and spat as silver melted among the coals. "She's not for sale," he said. "She never was." Lyle's smile thinned into something sharper. "That so?" The girl stood in the corner, barely breathing. Lyle glanced at her, held her gaze too long, then tipped his hat and left without another word. But the silence he left behind stuck like soot in her lungs. That night the blacksmith didn't eat. He worked long after the sun fell, pounding iron like it had insulted him. The girl sat by the window in her small room, clutching the blue ribbon Miss Eloise had given her years ago. She no longer wore it. It was too childish now, but she kept it close. Like a tether to a life she hadn't known how to hope for until now. She didn't speak of the encounter. He didn't either. But the next morning, she found a knife wrapped in cloth on the windowsill. Not a weapon. Carving knife. The handle smoothed by hand. A gift without words. She began to carve small things in the quiet hours. A bird, a leaf, the shape of a flame. It soothed something in her. Created instead of endured. But something had shifted. She knew now that the past was never truly past. That men like Lyle could crawl out from old chapters and try to rewrite you. And she knew, beyond doubt, that the blacksmith had chosen her freedom over profit. Not once, but again and again, without asking anything in return. She began to feel it then. A soft tremor beneath the ribs. Not love, not yet. But a question blooming slowly. What do you do with safety, once it no longer scares you? One afternoon, he found her in the corner of the stable, hammering out a pair of crude horseshoes from scrap metal. They'll never hold, he said, eyeing the bend in one of them. She didn't look up. They're not for a horse. He waited, and when she didn't explain further, he simply nodded. Try again tomorrow. I will. And she did. She made a second pair better. Still crooked, but stronger. He let her hang them above her door, where they caught the evening light just right. The days grew colder. Leaves turned brittle, breaking beneath boot heels like old promises. The girl stood taller now, moved with certainty. When customers came, they spoke to her without needing to ask who she was. She still didn't know what to call the blacksmith. She still didn't speak much. But sometimes, when she placed his dinner down at the end of a long day, she stayed longer at the table. And he didn't ask her to leave. She began writing too. In a ledger she found buried under old tack. She wrote things she didn't say out loud, memories, dreams, questions without answers. She wrote about the fire and the iron, about the feeling of being unchained slowly, one link at a time. Lyle did not return, but his shadow lingered, like a bruise that refused to fade. And in that shadow, the girl began to realize something hard and bright. She was not owned. Not by papers, not by memory, not even by kindness. She stayed because she chose to. Because this place, this rhythm of work and quiet and steady hands, had become something sacred. And though neither she nor the blacksmith spoke of the future, it hovered between them like breath in winter air, visible for just a moment, then gone. But she had seen it, and she knew now, without needing to be told, that the worst of her past could not take the best of her becoming. Not anymore. The winter came slow, like a hush falling over a crowded room. Snow didn't gather right away, but the air changed, bit through wool and lingered in the bones. The forge burned longer now. Fire became less a tool and more a comfort. In the evenings, she sat by it with her knees drawn to her chest, watching the embers pulse like the last red stars in a fading sky. She was 17 now. No longer a girl in people's eyes, though her heart still walked carefully, like a fawn testing the frost. Her face had sharpened, cheekbones cut clean, eyes steadier, but there was still softness there. It showed when she spoke to animals, or when she smoothed her palm over a dented saddle as if apologizing for its burden. The blacksmith had grown grayer. Not in hair, he'd always been pale as ash, but in silence. He'd begun sleeping less, waking before the roosters and working without pause. Something was stirring beneath his ribs. A weight he didn't name. She saw it. She didn't ask. They spoke more now, but never of things that hurt. Instead, they talked of practicalities. Wood grain, nail weight, the curve of a well-fitted bridle. But in the space between those words, something gentle moved. Not quite affection, not yet permission. But something near it. One morning, the girl took over the bellows while he sharpened a plow blade. He didn't say anything. Just watched as she stoked the flame, as if measuring the steadiness of her hands. That night, he handed her a folded piece of cloth. Inside, a leather apron stitched smaller to fit her frame. She traced the seams with trembling fingers. "You made this?" His gaze didn't waver. "You've earned it." She wore it like a vow. And with it came more responsibility. He began letting her take orders, letting her finish work without his eye over her shoulder. Trust, she realized, didn't come wrapped in grand gestures. It came in these quiet relinquishments. But peace, even hard-earned, does not go unnoticed by those who aim to spoil it. Lyle returned. He came at dusk, just as the wind turned sharp and the fire inside the forge painted the windows gold. She was alone. The blacksmith had gone to fetch iron from the depot. The bell above the door chimed, and before she looked up, she knew. Lyle hadn't aged. Or if he had, it had only refined the cruelty in his smile. He stepped into the warmth like it belonged to him. "You look different," he said. "But not so different I wouldn't know you." She gripped the edge of the anvil. "You shouldn't be here." "Oh, I should," he said, stepping closer. "See, I got to thinking. About debts unpaid. About ownership and time." Her mouth went dry. "You were paid." He smirked. "I was paid to take you. Not to raise you. Not to make you into what you've become." His eyes swept the forge like it disgusted him. "You live soft now. Think that means you're safe?" Her breath quickened. She kept her spine straight. "I'm not yours. Not then. Not now." He reached out, slow, deliberate, fingers grazing a strand of hair fallen loose from her braid. A sound broke the stillness. Bootstep. The blacksmith stepped into the doorway like a storm rolls over plains, slow and certain, carrying the weight of what it's about to undo. Lyle turned, too casual by half. "Ah, there he is. Thought I might catch you." The blacksmith's eyes did not move from the girl. "Did he touch you?" She shook her head, but her hands trembled. Lyle saw it. He grinned. "You're not the law," he said, turning back to the blacksmith. "And she's not your blood. You've got no claim on her." The blacksmith didn't answer with words. He walked past Lyle, slow and heavy, and picked up the tongs from beside the fire. Metal glowed in the coals, half forged, unfinished. He lifted it. The heat shimmered off the iron. "I've no claim," he said, voice like gravel. "But I've got hands. And memory. And fire enough to teach a lesson." Lyle flinched just slightly. Enough to show the cracks beneath his swagger. The blacksmith didn't lift the metal. He didn't need to. Lyle stepped back. "This isn't over," he spat, mask slipping. "She's worth more than whatever dust you've wrapped her in." The girl moved then, stepping forward, her voice clear. "You're right," she said. "I am worth more. Which is why I'll never belong to anything like you." Lyle stared at her, as if he'd heard thunder on a clear day. Then he turned, slammed the door, and vanished into the night. Silence reclaimed the forge. She sank to the stool by the hearth. Her breath caught somewhere between relief and fury. The blacksmith stood by the door, not moving, hands still wrapped in soot and iron. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "He'll be back. Men like that don't understand when they've lost." She nodded. "Let him come." His eyes met hers then, not as a guardian, not even as a teacher, but as something older. Something shared. "You're not a child anymore." "I know." And with that knowing came something irreversible. The fire no longer belonged to him alone. It lived in her too. In her shoulders. In her chest. In the scars she carried like stitched embroidery. That night she didn't sleep. She wrote in the ledger, hands shaking but steady. Words poured like molten iron. Asterisk, "I have burned and not broken. I have been made and unmade and still I rise." Asterisk. The town heard of the encounter by morning. Stories bent and bloomed in every mouth. Some said Lyle had come with a weapon. Others said the blacksmith chased him out with a glowing blade. The truth was quieter but no less powerful. The girl walked into the mercantile the next day with her chin lifted. She was not looked at. She was seen. Miss Eloise embraced her without a word. Tommy offered her a horseshoe he'd polished himself. Sheriff Hal only nodded and said, "You did what the law couldn't." That night, the blacksmith handed her a new key. She looked down at it, confused. "I cleaned out the back room," he said. "It's yours now. Has a stove. Better light." She hesitated. "Why?" His voice softened. "Because it's time." She took the key like it was a flame cupped in her palms. Later, when the forge quieted and the world settled into its usual hush, she stood in the doorway of her new space. It smelled of cedar and old paper. Her belongings, few as they were, fit easily inside. But it wasn't the furniture or the stove that made it feel different. It was the door. That she could close. That was hers to lock or open. That night, for the first time in her life, she slept without fear pressing against her spine. And when she dreamed, she did not see cages. She saw wings. The storm came at twilight, the sky heavy with bruise-colored clouds, the kind that hang low and listen. She had just finished shoeing a restless gelding when the first wind blew through the trees like a whispered warning. Dust curled up from the road. The chickens quieted. Even the dogs tucked their tails. Something in the air was wrong. The blacksmith stood at the forge, silent, sleeves rolled to his elbows, waiting for what he could not name. She was 19 now, no longer a girl pretending at strength, but a woman who had earned it in hours of heat and silence, of bruised knuckles and the sting of betrayal healed by kindness. Her name, once spoken like a question, now came from people's mouths with certainty. She had weight now, and she no longer flinched when men raised their voices. Not even in dreams. But that night she felt a tremor inside her. Not fear exactly, something older. Like the memory of a wound that hadn't fully closed. The town was shuttered by nightfall. Lights dimmed early. Doors locked. Even the saloon had gone quiet, its laughter packed away like winter linens. He came after dark. A hard knock at the forge door, then another, more urgent, less polite. The girl was the one to answer. She opened it to find Lyle, soaked in rain, his face taut with something feral. His fine coat was torn at the collar. Mud streaked his boot. But it was his eyes that frightened her. Not because they were wild, but because they were empty. As if every loss he'd ever carried had finally devoured him. "You think this ends here?" he hissed. "You think you can take what's mine and walk away?" The blacksmith stepped up behind her. "She was never yours." Lyle's hand moved toward his coat, and for the first time, she saw the glint of metal tucked there. Her body tensed, but she didn't move. She just breathed in slow, steady, deep, the way the fire had taught her. "I gave you a chance," Lyle growled. "You could have sold her back and washed your hands clean." "She's not a possession," the blacksmith said, voice like a low bell. "She's a forge-born soul, tempered stronger than men like you can break." Lyle spat. "You think she belongs with you?" An old ghost hammering steel in the dark. And it was then that the girl stepped forward, her voice calm and bright as lightning. "I don't belong to anyone," she said. "But I choose him. This place. This life." Lyle laughed, bitter and sharp. "You think choice matters out here? You were sold, girl. Like cattle. You think that washes off with a few years and a clean bed?" She stared at him, and something inside her, the last bit of shame, the last echo of powerlessness, burned to ash. "I wasn't sold," she said, voice rising like heat. "I was bought back. Not with coin. With kindness. With quiet. With days where no one touched me unless I reached first. I was unbroken by silence. Forged by fire. The storm outside cracked the sky open. Thunder shook the walls. And Lyle, for all his fury, for all the ugly in his bones, finally saw her. Not as a girl. Not even as a woman. But as something else. Something he couldn't name. Couldn't control. Could never again threaten. He reached for the pistol. Too slow. The blacksmith moved without warning, a blur of rage and purpose. The gun fell before it could rise. Kicked away, clattering into the dirt. Then fists met flesh. Not like a brawl. Like judgment. Like iron meeting iron, testing who would bend. The girl didn't scream. Didn't run. She stepped back only to keep her balance, and watched as the man who had bought her freedom made his stand. It was not a clean fight. Lyle got his hit. Blood showed at the corner of the blacksmith's mouth. But he did not fall. He did not falter. He fought like a man who had waited too long to protect what mattered. And when it was done, Lyle was on the ground, gasping, broken, not dead, but changed. Something in him had cracked wide open. Not a redemption. Just defeat. The girl stood over him. "I forgive you nothing," she said. "And I owe you less." She turned her back on him without fear. her hands steady even as they trembled inside. Sheriff Hal arrived minutes later. Someone had heard the noise and called him. Lyle was taken away in chains, still spitting curses that no one listened to. The storm passed by dawn. The forge was quiet. The blacksmith sat by the fire, hand wrapped in cloth. She stitched it for him, slow and careful. He winced once, then said softly, "You didn't flinch." She looked up. "I didn't need to." There was silence then, the kind that speaks louder than words. He nodded toward the ledger she always kept nearby. "Write this one down?" She smiled, small and tired and full. "I already did." Weeks passed. Spring nudged the snow away. Buds bloomed along fence lines. The town returned to rhythm, though people looked at her differently now. Not just with respect, but with awe. She had not just survived. She had chosen her own ending, and in doing so, rewritten every page before it. And one evening, when the forge was warm and golden, and the anvil sang a familiar song, the blacksmith placed a hand on her shoulder. "You ever think of opening your own shop?" She turned to him, eyes wide. "I'd help," he added. "Give you the space behind the stables. Teach you to file taxes, not just blades." She laughed, deep and bright. The kind of laugh she used to think belonged to someone else. "I think I'd like that," she said. And she meant it, because the fire had taught her many things: how to bend without breaking, how to burn without destroying. But most of all, it had taught her this: that even the most broken beginnings can be forged into something strong. That even a girl sold into silence could rise singing. And that love, quiet, patient, steady, does not rescue. It builds. So she built. Not alone. Not owned. But chosen. And she chose the fire. She chose the forge. She chose herself. And somewhere in the wind that passed over the plains that night, someone listening might have sworn they heard a hammer striking hot iron, and a heart, finally, set free. The sun lay heavy over the prairie, smearing the sky in copper and fire. Dust rose from the earth like memory, slow, curling, reluctant to settle. Out there, where the land stretched wider than a man's reach and time itself seemed to walk on creaking legs, a wagon sat still as a grave marker. The boards were weather-cracked, the wheel leaned slightly, and a girl, no more than 20, maybe less, was chained to the rear axle like a criminal. She did not cry. That part of her had long since gone dry. Her eyes, sun-bitten and wide, blinked against the wind but never wept. Her hair, tangled from days without washing or brushing, moved like scorched ribbon in the breeze. Dust clung to her dress, to her skin, to her silence. The chain looped around her wrist had rubbed her raw, the iron biting with each shift of her weight, but still she sat. Still she endured. The town passed by her as though she were a rock or a root, an inconvenient thing in the path of men with business. A few children stared, then were called away by mothers too nervous to linger. A shopkeeper paused once to mutter something to the sheriff, who only adjusted his belt and looked toward the saloon. And across from it all, on the porch of the chapel, the preacher sat smoking a pipe, watching her with a look caught between pity and contempt. She had said no. That was all. One syllable. "No, I won't marry him." The preacher's son had asked. Asked, of course, after whispering threats and promises, after her uncle, a thin, red-faced man with a laugh like a broken fiddle, told her she'd bring shame if she didn't. The boy was handsome in the way weeds are green, common, full of thorns. His smile was all teeth. She had seen what lay behind it. She had seen what it meant to be owned by a man like that. So she said no. And for that, she was chained. To wait. To be humbled, they said. To remember her place. A girl with no kin worth mentioning and too much pride in her eyes. She stopped speaking on the second day. They brought her food sometimes. Cold biscuits, a dipper of water, but no one asked how she was, or if she needed anything more. The sheriff told her once, through tobacco-stained teeth, "You can walk free any time, girl. All you gotta do is say you were wrong." But she didn't. She wouldn't. Her silence became its own kind of protest. one with more weight than 1,000 shouted word. By the fourth day, the wind picked up, restless and low, curling under the eaves of buildings and snatching at laundry on the line. The townsfolk said a storm was coming. Dust storms out here weren't uncommon, especially when the ground baked so dry it cracked like old pottery. The people hurried, horses led into barns, children called home, windows shuttered. And still she sat, her chain clinking faintly with each gust, her body bowed but unbroken. Late that afternoon, a man came riding in from the south. Alone. Horse limping. His coat was faded and sun-worn, sleeves rolled past his wrists. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but the stubble on his jaw and the set of his shoulders marked him plain, a man with work behind him. Not young, not old. Just used. Like a tool that had done what it was made for and bore the scars of use. He rode past the general store, past the saloon where men sat with drinks already warm in their hands, past the church where the preacher's pipe smoke still lingered like judgment in the air. He did not look around much, just rode slow, eyes scanning the street like a man half listening for something long forgotten. He saw her. He didn't stop. Not then. He rode on to the livery, where he dismounted without speaking, tied the reins loose. The stable hand, a boy barely into his teens, pointed him toward water. He nodded, led his horse by the bit, and disappeared into the dimness. But he had seen her. That evening, as the sky turned lavender and the first stars flickered behind streaks of wind-blown cloud, she heard something she hadn't heard in days. Footsteps not filled with hurry or disgust. Just slow, even, heavy like a man carrying his own weight instead of laying it on someone else. He stopped near her wagon. Not close. 10 paces, maybe. Enough to speak without crowding. She did not look up. He crouched. Set something down on the dirt between them. A tin cup. Full of water. Then he stood again. Waited a moment. The wind played with the brim of his hat. He looked at her the way one might look at a thorn bush blooming in the desert, cautious but not afraid. Then he walked away. The water sat untouched for a time. She stared at it like it might vanish. When night fell, and the sky went deep and quiet and the wind stilled, she reached out. Her hand trembled, whether from weakness or memory, even she couldn't say. She drank. Slowly. Each sip like a kindness she wasn't sure she deserved. She slept that night with her head against the wagon's wood, the stars turning above her like soft bells. No dreams. Just breath. Just the warmth of something new beginning. In the morning, he came back. Not with a gun or a speech or a preacher. Just a look. Just his hands. He knelt again. Not in prayer. In work. He pulled a knife from his belt. Nothing grand, just a tool. He slid it under the knot at her wrist. The rope frayed. Gave. Fell. She watched, still frozen, as he stood. No words. No demand. The chain clinked against the wheel. He offered a hand. She stared at it. At the scars. The dirt under his nails. The quiet in his eyes. Then she stood. And that, perhaps, was the beginning of the real story. He didn't speak much. Not because he lacked words. He just believed in using them carefully, like water during drought. His voice, when heard, was low and slow, shaped by the land more than books, and often carried the weight of things unsaid. Folks called him a widower in passing, but rarely with more than a shrug. Out here, loss was as common as dust. He lived half a day's ride from town, in a house he built himself before grief hollowed him out. The house was simple, sturdy timber, wide porch, roof patched 3 times over. A barn sagged behind it like an old man, and a split-rail fence leaned wherever the wind fancied. The land was stubborn, but he kept to it. He grew a few vegetables, raised hens, mended saddles when neighbors brought them. Solitude wasn't just comfort to him. It was survival. There was a photograph in his room, small and curling at the edges. A woman with a smile like spring thaw, holding a baby whose eyes mirrored hers. Neither lived now. Fever took them both in a single cruel month, and since then, he'd carried that silence with him the way others carried guns. The child's rattle still hung on a nail in the corner, untouched. He didn't speak their names anymore. Not out loud. He had not expected the girl. He had come to town for a spool of wire and nails for the fence. Nothing more. He'd planned to ride in, trade quiet nods with the shopkeep, and be gone before the saloon woke up proper. But when he saw her, chained, still, full of something too raw to name, it stirred something that hadn't moved in him for years. Not pity. Not desire. Just recognition. She was surviving something that should have broken her. The sheriff's voice had grated in his ears like rust when he'd asked why she sat there like a prisoner. Refused a man, was the answer. She had said no. The widower didn't reply. Didn't argue. Arguing out here was like spitting in the wind. It blew back on you. But he remembered the look in her eyes. How it held, even while her body seemed worn thin. Some folks called it defiance. He saw something quieter, deeper, will. The kind that doesn't shout or flail. The kind that outlives storms. He offered water first. That was all. A gesture, not a rescue. She could have kicked it away. She didn't. The next morning, he returned with no audience. When the rope came loose from her wrist, it didn't make a sound, but he imagined it might have echoed if the world had been listening. She stood, slow and unsteady. Dirt fell from her skirt like ash. He didn't reach for her, just walked beside her to his horse, keeping space wide enough for her to breathe. She didn't speak as they rode. The prairie stretched around them, endless and gold, the sky arching above like a quiet cathedral. He glanced her way once, saw her staring straight ahead, fists clenched in her lap. She was not weeping. She was watching. By midday they reached the creek near his land. He led the horse through the shallows, the water lapping over its hooves. The girl flinched when a bird darted from the brush. He slowed the horse, gentled the reins, gave her time. His house came into view, small against the open sky, with smoke curling from the chimney. He offered her a place on the porch, then brought a basin of water, soap, and an old cloth. Still no questions. She didn't speak, but when he left her to clean her hands, she did. That night, he gave her stew and a bed in the room once meant for a child. She touched nothing in it. Not the rattle, not the folded quilt. But she lay down and didn't leave. He slept in the barn. Each day after, they found new silence between them. Not empty silence, but respectful, waiting. He taught her to gather eggs from the coop, to check for fox print. She followed without fuss, her steps light. When she did speak, it was brief. "Where should I put this?" Or, "That hen's limping." He nodded, gave her answers plain and without tone. She watched everything, and he let her. One morning, he caught her staring at the fence he'd half mended. A section leaned inward where wind had knocked it loose. She asked if she could help. He handed her a hammer, and she fixed it. Later that week, she found the photograph on the mantel. She stared at it a long while, but didn't ask. He said, not looking up from where he carved kindling, "My wife. My boy." It was sickness. She only nodded. That night, she sat longer at the fire. He poured 2 cups of tea, slid one to her, and they sat without a word until the coals burned low. In town, they started whispering about her disappearance. The preacher's son made noise in the saloon, tried to stir the sheriff again. But no one saw her ride out. No one had seen the widower take her. And without that, there was only rumor. Back on the prairie, under stars sharp as needles, she woke one night to find him sitting on the porch steps, knees bent, face tipped to the sky. She joined him, wordless, and they watched the constellations stitch the dark together. She asked him, voice nearly gone, "Why'd you cut the rope?" He didn't answer right away. Then, because it shouldn't have been there. That was all. But in it was everything. As the wind moved through the grass and the night deepened, she let her shoulder lean gently toward his, barely touching, like a moth brushing a flame without burning. And he didn't move away. Spring edged in slowly that year, like someone too polite to knock. The ground softened day by day, and the wind lost its teeth. In the mornings, frost laced the windows, delicate as lace, and by noon, the hens were pecking at fresh shoots in the yard. The days unfolded in quiet rhythm. Two people, two routines merging like rivers converging into one silent current. She took to rising early, sometimes before he did. He'd hear her boots on the porch, a soft thud as she moved with care not to wake the house. Once, he watched through the window as she fed the chickens and stood still, palms open, letting one hen peck seed from her hand. Her mouth didn't smile, but her eyes did. He noticed that often now, how her eyes softened first. The widower repaired the barn roof with her help. She climbed the ladder without complaint, a hammer hooked to her skirt, her braids slung over her shoulder like a rope of dusk. He handed her nails, steadied the boards she braced, and when she slipped once, catching her breath sharp, he held her arm without speaking. His hand was steady, warm. She stayed still a second too long before climbing down. He didn't call her wife. Didn't call her anything at all, truth be told. She didn't ask for a title, didn't offer a past. What bloomed between them came slow, unspoken, like seeds dropped by wind. No vows were exchanged, but habits were, hers curling around his quiet anchoring hers. Still, the past does not sleep just because no one speaks of it. One afternoon, a rider came. Dust trailed behind him like a bad omen. The girl saw first. She was chopping wood behind the barn and froze, axe midair, her breath going thin. The man on the horse was dressed in clean clothes, stiff with self-importance. His hat was new, his boots polished. He dismounted with the swagger of someone used to being heard. He didn't greet the widower, just looked toward her with narrowed eyes. "I'm here for the girl," he said. The widower didn't rise from where he sat repairing a bridle. "She's not a thing to be fetched. She's a runaway. Her uncle sent for her. Claims she's taken refuge here. Says she's needed back." "She's not needed anywhere she don't choose to go," the widower replied, his voice like slow rain on tin. The rider laughed, but it was short, brittle. "You harboring her's theft. Maybe worse. You know the preacher's son made a formal claim. You've no right." Behind the barn, the axe slipped from her fingers. She didn't step forward. She didn't run. She simply stood there, jaw set, breath measured. The wind, sharp again after days of softness, tangled her skirt and lifted dust around her boots. "I ain't hiding her," the widower said, standing now. "She's free here. That's the whole of it." The man stepped closer. "You're asking for trouble. I've had worse company." The rider spat, turned to mount his horse again. "Town'll hear about this. Then let them." He left without more words, the horse kicking up resentment as he went. That night they didn't eat. The air inside the house was thick. She paced once, then again. Finally, she looked at him. "I can leave," she said, not as fear, but fact. He shook his head. "You won't run. Not again. I won't put you in the fire for something I lit." He turned toward her, eyes dark like deep water. "The fire's not yours. It's theirs. For chaining a girl who dared say no." She wanted to argue, but his voice, so quiet, so sure, left no space for doubt. She sat beside him, and for a long while they said nothing. Only shared the weight of the silence between them like two hands on the same burden. A few days passed. No one came. But she changed. She began mending the house with fresh energy, cleaning windows no one saw, tending rows of vegetables with a tenderness almost maternal. And in the evenings, she read aloud from an old book she found tucked beneath a floorboard, pages faded, the binding frayed. Her voice was hesitant at first, but he listened as though it were scripture. He didn't tell her she'd brought laughter back to the walls. She wouldn't have believed it. One day, she asked if she could ride alone into town. He hesitated. She held his gaze. "I'm not afraid anymore." So he gave her his second horse, a slow one, but steady. She rode with her head high, her braid loose, her shoulders unhidden. The town was quieter than she remembered, the same buildings but smaller now. No one stopped her. Some looked away. A few whispered. At the general store, the shopkeep stared but didn't speak. She bought thread, flour, and 1 tin of honey. She left money on the counter, turned, and walked out. On the way back, she passed the preacher's son. He leaned against the post office, arms folded, smirk ready. She didn't slow. He called after her. "You'll come back," he said. "Women like you always come back." She stopped then, turned, walked up until only a breath stood between them. "No," she said. "I've buried the part of me that ever bowed to you." He didn't follow. She rode home with the sun behind her, lighting the path gold. That night she didn't sleep in the child's room. She stepped into the room where he lay, barefoot and silent. Her eyes held no uncertainty. He moved over without speaking, as though he'd been waiting for this moment through every quiet day, every careful glance. She lay beside him, not as a wife given, but as a woman who had chosen. The wind outside stirred the curtains. The stars blinked above the house. And 2 lives, once broken, bent toward each other like young trees finding shape in the same wind. The morning they came was quiet. The sky was pale, not yet blue, and the frost curled in white fingers along the porch rail. She was out early, as always, shawl wrapped tight, checking the henhouse. He was on the woodpile, splitting logs smooth as ribbons. Neither spoke. The silence between them had grown companionable, like breath, like heartbeat, always there, never noticed. She saw the dust cloud first. A slow rise on the horizon. Not one rider. 4, maybe 5. Distant, but purposeful. Her stomach didn't turn this time. Her feet didn't falter. She walked back to the porch with a calm that surprised her. He looked up at her, saw her eyes, and understood. Without words, he went inside. She followed. He pulled the rifle from above the hearth. Not to use it, not unless he had to. It hadn't been fired since his boy was buried. He set it down on the table, not as a threat but as a truth. She laid her hand on it. "They'll say it's theirs," she said. "That I am." "They're wrong," he replied. A minute passed between them like a prayer. When the riders arrived, they did not storm the porch or shout like wolves. They dismounted in a line, boots heavy on the ground, hats pulled low. The preacher's son stood at the front, all clean boots and crooked righteousness. "I told you we'd come," he said. The widower stepped forward, slow, one hand resting at his side, open. "You're not welcome here." "She's mine," the man said, his voice sharp as bone. "She was promised." "No one can promise a person," the widower answered. "That's not how people work." She fled an agreement. An oath. Her uncle wants her returned. She was chained. She refused the Lord's will. She stepped forward then, her boots landing square beside the widower's. Her face was calm, her eyes unflinching. She wore no fine dress, no badge of rebellion, just the apron she'd gardened in, dust on her hands, sun on her cheeks. But she looked like a flame the wind couldn't touch. "I never belonged to you," she said. "And I never will." The preacher's son sneered. "You're confused. You think you're free because you hid in a shack. That ain't how the law works." "I'm not hiding," she said. "I'm living. And no law written by men afraid of women can unmake what I've built with my own hands." The man's temper flared. "You'll regret this." The widower's voice was soft behind her. "She's not alone." One of the riders shifted. Then another. Young men. Neighbors maybe. Ones who'd once traded stories with the widower. Men who knew loss. One of them stepped back. Another lowered his eyes. The preacher's son looked behind him, realized his weight had become lighter than his own boot. He reached for his belt. The widower stepped in front of her, rifle up, not pointed, just held. "Don't." A stillness fell over everything. Even the horses stopped. The wind passed through the grass like an old song. The kind that knew sorrow but didn't bow to it. Finally, the preacher's son lowered his hand. His face twitched, fury bruising his pride. He spat on the ground, then turned without a word, climbed onto his horse, and rode. The others followed. Not with haste. Not with honor. Just silence. She watched them go until they vanished into the horizon, the dust of their coming swept away by wind. When they were gone, she didn't weep. She didn't collapse. She walked to the woodpile, picked up the axe, and split a single log. The widower said nothing. He just watched, like someone witnessing the first green shoot after a long winter. That evening, they didn't speak of what had passed. They sat by the fire. He polished the old rifle. She darned a pair of socks. The dog, which had followed her home from the creek weeks ago, curled up beside her, snoring. Later, they stood at the edge of the field. Spring had finally crept its full way in, crocus blooming near the fence, frogs calling from the marsh. She took his hand, and he let her. "You think they'll come back?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. "Will we be ready?" "We already are." She leaned her head against his shoulder. That night, when the moon rose, it caught in the window glass and lit their faces where they lay. No chains. No fear. Just two souls who had chosen one another, quiet and sure. The land remembers, they say. It remembers every footfall, every buried root, every woman who said no and was punished, every man who stood between her and the ones who would not see her whole. But the land also remembers the brave, and long after the preacher's son grew old and bitter, long after the town forgot the noise and the dust, the field where they lived grew taller, richer. A swing hung from the tree out back. A rocking chair rested on the porch. And sometimes, just sometimes, those who passed near that place could hear laughter. Real, deep laughter. Like water finally breaking loose through stone. The land knew then. Freedom wasn't given. It was made.